Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and I have today a returning guest, Rosie Whitehouse, who is the author of the book People on the Beach, Journeys, can you see that? Journeys to Freedom After the Holocaust. But we're going to be discussing a very specific topic today, which is Pesach of April 1946, almost a year after liberation. So Rosie's going to set the scene with the Seder first, and then we're going to go back to actually set the scene even more. But go ahead, tell us about the Seder first.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me again. First, I want you to use your imaginations. This is April 1946. It's almost a year since the liberation of Dachau. Now, Pesach falls on the 15th, the eve of Pesach on the 15th of April. There is an extraordinary gathering that takes place in Munich in the Deutsches Theater. 200 survivors and American GIs gather together in the restaurant. Now, the restaurant is one of the few that's still functioning in Munich, and it was a very popular restaurant with the Nazi regime before the fall of the Nazis. It's a really luxurious place. And when the survivors walk in, they're greeted by members of the US Army. The tables are laid with exquisite white linen, with silver cutlery, with beautiful china and lovely wine glasses. And on the table are all sorts of beautiful flowers. It's a luxurious scene that a survivor would not have seen before the war if they were poor, or had not seen since the war if they were richer. Now, what's significant is that at every place was the most extraordinary Haggadah. It was one of the first that had been printed since the fall of the Nazi regime. And on the front cover was a large white A in a red circle.
Wait, you want to hold it up? You want to hold your copy up?
I don't have that version of it here, but as many of you will immediately know, this is a symbol of the US Army. Now, you might think that's part of the story, which is great because the US Army are doing really nice things for Jews in Bavaria. But we'll roll back in a minute and we'll see that that's not really the case. So that's shock number one for the survivor when he sits down at the table. Now, this Haggadah was not the conventional one that we always read at Pesach. It was what many rabbis might consider actually a sacrilegious text, which had told the Pesach story through the Holocaust. It began with, "We had been slaves for Hitler in Germany." Now, this is a very dramatic statement. It spoke directly to the survivors who believed that what they had been through was on equal, if not more important than what had happened to the Jews when they had been slaves to the Pharaoh. Now, this dramatic text was written by a gentleman called Joseph Scheinson. He was a survivor from Kovna, and we'll go on to read some of this text in a minute. But his text was illustrated by some of the most dramatic woodcuts that you can imagine, which gave the Haggadah a terrifying mystery. And I want to just hold up this book, which is my version of it, to show you some of these texts. Now, if you can see here, you can see that there are the chimneys, there is the survivor, and here are the children and the old people. Now, these texts were drawn by Miklos Adler, who was a survivor from Debrecen. He had been in Auschwitz himself, and he had ended also in the DP camps in the American sector. Now, I think that before we read from this Seder and we understand how dramatic it was, that we need to wind back a little bit to a year before so we can put the situation in context. I want you to imagine that you are one of the young survivors who has been invited to this Seder. And you are sitting down. You're 18 years old. You have come through death ghettos, death camps, death marches. You have been in the most appalling situation when you were liberated in Dachau and its subcamps. And now here you are at this luxurious table surrounded by American soldiers. Now, what has happened to you in the 12 months before this Seder? Now, the American army, as I'm sure many of you who are watching, liberated the Dachau concentration camp on the 29th of April, 1945. The American soldiers were totally unprepared for what they found, just like their counterparts in the Soviet army who had liberated Auschwitz and the British who had liberated Bergen-Belsen. And they struggled to deal with the situation because before the liberation, Dachau was one of these camps which had literally become a dumping ground as the Nazis brought people from the concentration camps which were nearer the front and tried to keep the survivors either as bargaining chips or as workers that they could use the very last moment to build fortifications in the Tyrol in the case of Dachau. Now, I'm going to tell you the story of a gentleman called Rabbi Abraham Klausner. And he was the first rabbi to walk into the Dachau concentration camp.
He's the U.S. Army chaplain.
He was a U.S. Army chaplain, yes. He was just 30 years old. And he also was totally unprepared by what he would see when he walked in. He had been briefed before he left New York. And in their wisdom, the Jewish societies in New York had decided that what the survivors in Europe really needed was some plastic mezuzah in little plastic bags. And that's what he had stuffed in his pockets. Well, that just shows you a lot of what people actually understood about what had happened in the Holocaust. It wasn't even called the Holocaust at this point, obviously. Now, Klausner, he walked into the barracks and he saw the people there. And one of the men in the barracks called out and said, "Do you know my brother? My brother's also an army chaplain." And at this point, Klausner realized that the only way to treat these people was to give them their name and their voice back. So instead of handing out the plastic mezuzahs, he went and rummaged through these huge supplies in Dachau. Because remember, Dachau was like a massive camp. It was also a training camp for the SS. And he found himself a typewriter. He found himself paper. And he took it back to the barracks and he said, "Write down your names." And he then printed a list of the survivors. Now, this is a really unique document, which is largely forgotten in Jewish history, but he printed, and it's very unusual because when there's a war or a disaster, we don't print the names of the people who survive. We usually print the names of the people who are dead. Well, that was way beyond the comprehension of anybody to print 6 million names then. We didn't even know. We still don't know. But he printed the names of the survivors, giving them their voice, their chance to reconnect. Now, Klausner really connected with these people, and these people were in a terrible situation. So imagine again that you are that young 18-year-old sitting down at the Seder a year later, that you had been in this destitute moment. Nobody is helping you. They begin to organize displaced persons camps, but you could find yourself in a displaced persons camp lying next to you in the bunk as a Ukrainian or a Pole or a German who has persecuted you in the ghettos or in the concentration camps themselves. And there was no special treatment for the Jews. They weren't recognized as a nation. Now, Klausner began to lobby that they should be. It's a very long story, which if you're interested in detail, you can buy a copy of my book, People on the Beach, Journeys to Freedom After the Holocaust. But in a nutshell, Klausner began to really understand the survivors, and he began to campaign among the American authorities in Bavaria, and he managed to get his message back to the White House, which is why we get the Harrison Report, in which Jews are allowed to have their own displaced persons camps. Now, that's a very little simple statement for me to make, but boy, is this a big statement in Jewish history, because it's the first time Jews have been recognized as a nation. It's a really incredible moment. And so they're allowed to have a Jewish displaced persons camp in Feldafing. Now, situation doesn't really improve. They've still got nothing to do. They've got no hope of where to go. The British have kept the white paper in place, which limits immigration into Palestine. Most of the doors to any country where you might want to actually go are all closed, what do you do? You're stuck in a destitute place. Now, this is not a very difficult thing for us to understand because we see refugees in these situations now. You only have to think about what is going on in Cox's Bazar with refugees there, what is going on with refugees from Syria. We see the issues of refugees sitting with no homes to go back to. It's a huge problem. And disillusion can quickly set in. Now, what's really important to understand, because we're going to go back to talk about Pesach and the dramatic survivors Haggadah in a minute, is actually what happened at Yom Kippur. Because
Wait, can I interrupt for 1 minute to say that I just want to tell people that the number of people who are in Dachau, the Jews in Dachau, etc., at the end of the war were augmented by thousands and thousands and thousands of more people, Jews, who went east, went back east, looked for survivors of their families, and then came back to the American sector, not wanting to be in the Soviet sector. So now the numbers have swelled dramatically at this point.
I might also add, you said not wanting to be in the Soviet sector, but they didn't want to be in the British sector either, because the British weren't particularly nice. And the British had no Harrison report, and they did not recognize the Jews as a nation, and they deported them back to their countries. And there was no recognition of Zionist movements within the DP camps in the British sector. So you certainly didn't want to go there.
So, in fact, I just realized the movie from many, many, many years ago, Before Winter Comes, when Topol, the Israeli actor, is sent back at the last moment, trying to prove, even though we, the audience, know that he's telling the truth. I think that was the British Army instead of the
Yeah,
American Army.
we have a very bad record on this front, I have
Okay,
to say,
go ahead.
which we don't teach in schools here, just to add. Anyhow, so
Okay,
let's take us to the very first big festival after the liberation. It is Yom Kippur, September 1945. Now we're in Feldafing. A large barn had been taken over as a synagogue, and the rabbi who led the service at Yom Kippur was a very famous rabbi, the Klausenberger rabbi. And I know very well somebody who was actually at the service. He was 12 years old at the time. His name is Ivor Pearl. He was from Mako in Hungary. And he
can
had,
I just say that Ivor Pearl has his own book, which I just read,
oh,
that,
yeah,
yeah. So, okay,
yes, he does.
chicken
And
soup under the tree, right?
chicken soup under the tree, and there's also a very clever cartoon which has come out about him. And just maybe out of interest, before I tell you a story, is that I work as a historical advisor to an organization called the 45 Aid Society, who represent the 700 odd child survivors who were brought to the UK after the war, and Ivor was among them, and he came in October 1945 to the UK. So he was not actually at this Pesach dinner, but he was at this Yom Kippur. Now, the Yom Kippur, this barn was completely crammed out with people. There were not enough prayer books to go round. And he sat down, he survived with his brother, Alec, and he sat down and listened to the service. And the cantor sang beautifully. And it was at that moment that Ivor realized he would never feel his mother's arms around him again. And he realized the enormity of what he had lost. He had lost his parents, and he had lost 7 of his brothers and sisters. And he ran out of the synagogue crying and could not go back in. So that is what Yom Kippur was like for most survivors. It was a moment of extraordinary outpouring of grief. Now, just to put the American Army in context here, Patton and Eisenhower also went to this service, and they described in their diaries afterwards that the Rabbi Klausenberger looked like Henry VIII and was full of lice and filthy, and the Jews were speaking mumbo jumbo in a barn. So it just goes to show what the Americans were actually thinking of our Jewish survivors at this point.
I know Patton was very anti-Semitic, but Eisenhower also wrote this in his diary.
Yes, yes, both of them. And so after this event, Abraham Klausner, the young 30-year-old rabbi who has taken on his shoulders the whole effort of trying to care for the tens of thousands of Jewish refugees who are now flooded into the American sector. He knew he had to do something to help these people. They had food, they had clothes, they had a roof over their heads, but it's not enough for man to live by bread and water alone. They needed psychological sustenance. So over the winter of 1945 to 46, he began to look about preparing for the Pesach service. And he was very closely aligned with a very powerful group of Jewish survivors from Kovna. So it's no surprise that and
Lithuania.
Kovna, of course, is today Kaunas in Lithuania. It was then Kovna, which was also part of Lithuania then. And famous for the Kovna ghetto. Many of you have heard of it. The male survivors from the Kovna ghetto were taken to the Kaufering subcamp of Dachau, which is why so many of them ended up there. But they were a very powerful group of people. Jews from Kovna had a huge sense of self-esteem because there were so many of them in pre-war Kaunas that they did all sorts of jobs like modern Israel. They were like, and they had a huge sense of self. And among them were some very important leaders, among them a man called Zalman Grinberg, who became a very close friend of Klausner. And this, he must no doubt have introduced Klausner to Josef Schensen, who had written this dramatic text, and also then have helped him to discover Miklos Adler, who did these incredible woodcuts.
But they were not done for the Haggadah, right? The woodcuts were done before.
The woodcuts were done for the Haggadah once Klausner had discovered the text of Scheinson. And exactly how that was put together, I'm afraid I don't know. Maybe nobody knows. Because people like Klausner were men of action. They didn't waste time sitting down writing letters like today I went here and there and what there. They just got on and did it. He jumped in his Jeep and shot off. He was 30 years old and a real dynamic character. And when I wrote People on the Beach, actually, my eldest son was 30 years old. And so I really kind of felt for Klausner and his dynamic energy and what he was trying to do. And so by the time...
For which he was frequently called in front of American military authorities, et cetera, et cetera. But that's another story. Okay, go ahead.
No, this is an important story. It's why he's forgotten, because he was considered the naughty boy. So you don't remember naughty boys. You want to get them rid of. You want to forget them. And Klausner also played a very important role. Much later, he was sent away from the American sector, but he came back and he did, and then he helped to funnel the Jews who had been on the exodus out back through the American sector in 1948. So he played some very dramatic roles. I mean, I always think of him really as the post-war Moses, and it's incredible that he's forgotten. But often men of action who don't leave huge amounts of letters, they tend to be brushed away by history, and so in that sense, I urge all of you to read the book and to think about him and to remember that great men in history are not always the people that we remember, like Eisenhower and Patton and these kinds of people. But anyway, to take us back now to the spring. Now, there's a very important thing happens is that the General Patton is replaced by General Lucien Truscott, and he's much more sympathetic to the fate of the Jews. And when Klausner approaches him to ask him if he will endorse this Haggadah, he says, yes, of course. And he allows for the US Army insignia to be put on the front of it. Remember, it takes us back to that moment when that young survivor sits down at that table and picks up that Haggadah. And what does he see? He sees the emblem of the US Army on the front of it. Suddenly the US Army are endorsing Jews. Boy whiz. Now you can see in the context of what I just said. And and Truscott even arranged for Klausner to have them printed in the former Nazi printing house of Bruckmann KAG. And this was actually paid for by the US Army. So this is a really, really important moment. And I want to read you some of the things that Klausner actually said at this
Before
dinner.
you say that, I just want to say you can actually get this Haggadah. It's called a Survivor's Haggadah. And my daughter got it somewhere, I assume on Amazon, but it's fascinating.
You can also watch a film about it at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum website because they have one of the originals in their archives.
Okay, so now take it away that you're going to read.
I'm going to read you now. Klausner stood up to introduce the service. And in the English introduction, Klausner had written in the Haggadah, and khaki-clad sons of Israel, commanded by Lieutenant General Truscott, gathered together, as was the custom in Israel, to celebrate the Passover festival. Now, what Klausner did at that moment as he stood up, he was an orator, like so many clever rabbis. And he stood up and he wanted to unite the survivors with the US Army. Now, this is really political because Klausner's big friends, the ones from Kovna I just mentioned, they're all Zionists and they're head of the Committee of the Liberated Jews of Bavaria. And although Klausner himself always said he wasn't a Zionist and he couldn't see any difference, he just went where you wanted to go. And if you wanted to go to Israel, to Palestine, that was fine. He was endorsing the Zionist cause. Now, Klausner also understood what had happened at Yom Kippur was the shock of realizing that you had survived, but your loved ones had not. And how could you rationalize that in your memory? And that is why much of the text that you'll find within the Haggadah is both bitter and ironic. And I'm going to read you a section now. When the righteous among the nations of the world saw that Hitler had decided to exterminate Israel, their great assembly came together and out of their great sorrow decided to keep silent. And the children of Israel groaned and cried out, but were not heard. And they cried out to the Lord, the God of their fathers, who saw their suffering and oppression, and the cry went up. The survivors' Haggadah, it spoke directly to the survivors in a way that nothing else could. And that's really the incredible thing, because the young man, the 18-year-old that I'm talking about here, he was called Yuri Hanuk, and he sat down at this meal. And then he realized he had to go to Israel. And he traveled illegally on the Josiah Wedgwood, which is the boat that I write about in my book. And this inspired a Zionism within him. Now, this is another example of it. To the child's simple question, the one everybody always loves because it always involves a cheeky little member of the family, why that night was different from all other nights. This was Klausner's Haggadah's answer. The passage about the four sons was retold in Zionist terms. In the survivors' Haggadah, the wise son is told, "Who knows how long their charity and their protective arm shall extend to us? A home and a country should not come out of charity, but by right." So this is a really important text. It's speaking to the leaders of the American military, and it's speaking to the young members of the survivors who they want to inspire because they will bring along with them the others. And it's talking to the leaders of the Jewish community within Bavaria. So this is the power of it. And I think I want to show you one more of these woodcuts because it really shows this incredible drama. And you can see here a Nazi is pulling a child away from his mother. That is what it meant to these people. And it's really incredible that this is a largely forgotten book. It's almost similar to Abercrombie's whole telling of the Holocaust in the way that we tell the Talmudic tales. There are these dramatic books that came out of the Holocaust, which were then pushed away and shoved away. There are many questions as to why that happened. In the case of this, I think it's that people moved on and probably left the Haggadahs behind in Bavaria, and time moved on. But it was also not a story that maybe the American army wanted to say when things started to get a bit tricky in the Middle East, and not a story that Klausner ever wanted to blow his trumpet about, because he was a man of action and he carried on being a man of action all his life, helping the oppressed. There was no time to look back on the last person you helped. You had to look forward to the future.
I'm smiling because I'm suddenly remembering that my husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany for 2 Pesachs, and I have still in my documents the Southern Bavaria mimeographed Haggadah from both years. So I just realized that tradition continued in Bavaria in a much, but that I think that, and I think that I'm as guilty as anyone else of this. I'm not really thinking about those years that the DPs were stuck in camps under conditions that were not even close to ideal for a liberated people.
Yes, I mean, we're talking here about Pesach 1946, but there were 10 more Pesachs to come for those survivors who were in the Forenwald DP camp. That camp did not close till 1957. Now, most of the people who got stuck there were people who were sick or elderly, who were not considered suitable candidates to be taken to, firstly, legally on illegal immigration to Palestine mandate by the Yeshuv, by the Jewish people, the Jewish organization in the Palestine mandate, or then by the Israeli government. One's heart goes out to those. I mean, we say elderly. I mean, I think it would have made me a dinosaur. We're talking about people who are probably about 40, who are considered too old to be of any use to the Israeli state, and they were not considered of any use to anybody else. There were big programs that came out at the end of the war, orchestrated largely by the JDC, to take children from Germany and from Czechoslovakia and other places where they were liberated and bring them to Sweden, Switzerland, the UK, America, and then eventually Canada. But this included only 5,000 children.
We're talking orphans, and we're talking Elie Wiesel, right, who was taken to Switzerland.
We are talking orphans, but many of them had surviving parents who saw that it was the wisest thing to do was to get their children out of Europe as quickly as possible, and there were limitations on that emigration. Firstly, that initially they had to be under 16, but on the first transport that came to the UK to a place called Windermere, you might have seen this film, The Windermere Children. These kids were supposed to be under the age of 16, but some of them were 21, 22, but they were also small and malnourished that nobody knew what they were doing. And back on the ground, this was in the Theresienstadt ghetto, the people who were organizing it were quite happy to lie. The guys who were waiting for them in Windermere had no idea, and every bed had a teddy bear on. So it was a bit of a shock when the guys arrived. But yes, but for most people, it was 10 more, many people, it was 10 more years in these camps in Belsen. Really appalling conditions. Although there was an amazing Jewish revival within the DP camps, not only in the American sector, also in the British sector in Bergen-Belsen, where there was a Jewish religious revival, a Zionist revival, a cultural revival, a Yiddish revival, and a revival of life in general. These were places where babies were born and shows were put on and people began to live again. So we can feel negatively But I think, you know, we should think more positively in the end. And in the end, nobody, those camps still don't exist. So there was, in the end, a real Passover.
I do know, by the way, people who were born in DP camps. Uh, so it is an amazing story of revival, of renewal. I think that for the Pesach holiday, it's part of the theme, liberation, freedom, etc., ren renewal. And I just think I thank you so much for sharing this story and your enthusiasm. And just okay, so you can get her book, and I will put the link in the description. And I'm just thrilled that when I interviewed her before about her more recent book, Two Sisters, Betrayal. What's the title of that one?
Betrayal, love, and resistance in occupied France.
Right. I learned that she'd then written this book. And then I said, oh, for Passover, for Pesach, we have to have you back on to explain Klausner. And I just want to say a pitch for remembering Klausner. He went against every military rule that he could to champion what he called his people. And I think he should be remembered for that. And I think this Survivors of Goddess should be, I encourage people to buy it. There's still time, I believe. I mean, I think it comes from Amazon and can probably be delivered in time to, if you're looking for a new experience this year. So I thank you, Rosie, so much for this encouraging talk. And I thank our listeners. And I have to say, though, may the memory of the victims and those who tried to save them be a blessing forever, and Chag Sameach for Pesach.